Story 1.
In a small, cold prison cell with no bed, a dark-haired young woman around 25 years old crouched in one corner. Her name was Grendel, a junior officer in the kingdom's armed forces, and she awaited her release, convinced she had done nothing wrong. After all, could defending an officer's honor truly be called a crime? Even if she was the lowest-ranked officer, she was still an officer after all. She'd only been given her rank a few weeks prior after surviving the defense of the Lone Tower Fortress. The misunderstanding that led her here had happened just yesterday. She and her squad, an all-female unit, were practicing their sword techniques in front of the barracks when a few men walked by in light chainmail, their breastplates bearing some kind of crest. Grendel was unfamiliar with heraldry, as she'd spent most of her life in a border fortress, where any officers sent over were usually commoners who'd risen through the ranks. Nobles rarely ventured to the fringes of the kingdom, especially to a place as remote as Lone Tower Fortress, with only soldiers and a sparse support staff and 2 days' ride to the nearest town, if you traveled without stopping. One of the nobles stopped, and loud enough for everyone to hear, said to his companion, "Look at how they're holding those swords. They'd be much more useful in the kitchen than on the battlefield." The remark cut deeply. Unable to bear such an insult, Grendel challenged him. "Why don't you show us how it's done?" she said, stepping into stance with her wooden training sword, daring her critic to demonstrate his skills, even though she knew he far outmatched her in both strength and physical ability. She could only hope to leave him with a few bruises as a reminder, even if she ended up taking a beating herself in front of her squad. Such duels occasionally took place at Lone Tower, but the capital was a far cry from the fortress at the kingdom's edge, and the laws here were different. The nobleman was taken aback, his face turning red with anger. He stammered, unable to find the words to respond. "What's the matter? Dry throat?" Grendel asked mockingly. Then laughing, she added, "Need some water? Too bad there's no servant around, only soldiers." Gathering himself, the nobleman roared, "Arrest her!" 2 royal guards appeared instantly and led her off to prison. Now, Grendel passed the time watching a sunbeam dance across the wall. Suddenly, the cell door creaked, and 2 large armored guards with royal crests on their chests appeared. "Am I free to go?" Grendel asked hopefully. "Only after the royal trial," one of them replied, gesturing for her to step out. "On what grounds am I being tried?" she asked, surprised by this sudden turn of fate. "You'll find out soon enough," said the more talkative of the guards, giving her a push. "I'm just a soldier." In the corridor, 2 other guards were waiting. One was an officer, and the other a royal guard. The officer explained what she could and couldn't do and what actions might immediately result in death. Then the group moved down a long corridor, with Grendel in the middle, the guards ahead and behind her. Once outside the prison, they crossed a large courtyard and stopped in front of a massive door with the words "Royal High Court" emblazoned in golden letters. She didn't have to wait long before a man appeared in the doorway and announced, "Enter." The senior guard reminded Grendel once more about the rules. She confirmed she understood, and the 2 guards marched her inside as if on parade while Grendel followed with her head held high. Inside the grand hall, lit only by sunlight streaming through large stained glass windows, there was just one attendee, her accuser, draped today in an expensive cloak with the same crest that had adorned his armor the day before. 10 yards from the throne, flanked by 4 judges in black robes with royal emblems, the escort halted with Grendel before the king's seat. A young court secretary stood up from behind a table piled with papers and writing instruments. "This session will hear the case of assault on a captain of the Royal Guard," he announced, proceeding to recite the captain's numerous titles before concluding, "The floor is given to the complainant." The insulted captain began to speak, but Grendel wasn't listening. She awaited her turn, but it never came. The moment the captain finished his speech, the presiding judge and king stood and addressed the other judges. "Your judgment?" "Guilty," they replied in unison. Grendel opened her mouth to defend herself, but a soldier standing beside her nudged her, whispering, "Stay silent if you don't want the gallows." No matter how hard she tried to hold back, tears of frustration and helplessness slid down her cheeks. Yet the king maintained his stern expression, prepared to pronounce the sentence. But before he could, the heavy courtroom doors creaked open, and the sound of heavy boots echoed against the stone floor. A man in a long black cloak with the hood drawn up strode toward the king, his face hidden. Though Grendel had never seen him before, she immediately knew who he was. She had heard the stories. It was said that the king's secret advisor wielded almost unlimited influence. Grendel couldn't believe such a powerful man would come here because of her, a nobody of humble birth. But she prepared herself for the worst, as the advisor was rumored to be the most feared figure in the kingdom. "The offending officer shall be sent as commander of the garrison in the sea citadel," the advisor announced. The presiding judge stood frozen in shock at this proposed sentence, but the advisor shook him from his stupor, adding, "As punishment for the crime." "Yes," the king agreed, resuming his seat. One of the court members scoffed, clearly displeased, as the sentence seemed more like a promotion than a punishment. The advisor fixed the man with a piercing glare before reminding everyone, "The king's command is law." To quell any further dissent, the judge clapped his hands 3 times, signaling that the judgment was final and unchangeable. "The new garrison commander must report to the sea citadel without delay, as the former commander passed away a month ago." With that, the advisor turned and strode from the room. Before Grendel knew it, she held not a sentence of conviction, but a royal decree of appointment. Leaving the courthouse, she hurried to thank the advisor for what he had done for her, but he had already disappeared, whisked away in a black carriage. Resolving to thank him at the first opportunity, Grendel returned to her quarters in the barracks, which the garrison commandant had assigned her, as she had no means to rent even a small room on the city's outskirts. Bidding farewell to her squad, with whom she had bonded and formed friendships, she packed her life's belongings into a plain soldier's chest. There was still space left inside. That same day she joined a convoy bound for the coast of the great ocean and left the capital. A week later, without any incidents along the way, the young woman finally arrived on the outskirts of Seaford City. What lay before Grendel was a haunting scene of desolation and decay, a shadow of the once great city that had been one of the kingdom's largest. She rode her horse through deserted streets, where only the wind swept through, stirring up thick clouds of dust. Abandoned buildings watched her with dark, hollow windows, their doors and shutters creaking a lonely greeting. As the new commander of the garrison drew closer to the bay, guarded by the massive fortress that lent the city its name, the signs of life grew more frequent. Scattered inhabited buildings and a few locals. Passing the town hall, Grendel chose not to introduce herself to the city governor yet, deciding she would wait until after assuming her post. After the main administrative building, the streets grew livelier, and small signs over shops and taverns began to appear here and there. The most bustling place was the local market, located in the port. Nearly every structure in the area had been repurposed for the townspeople's needs: warehouses, barracks, and docks. The only untouched structures were a few outdated warships, still formidable in appearance, and the crumbling, long-neglected fortress that housed the military garrison. It was all evidence that Seafort City was living through a difficult period in its history. Several years earlier, a surge in crafts and trade had swept through the kingdom, leading to the rapid rise of trade cities not only near the borders but also along the coast of the Great Ocean. Pottery and metal goods attracted buyers not only from nearby kingdoms, but also from island nations and others without land borders. Seafort City could have become a trade hub, but at that time, it was home to nearly the entire Royal Navy, leaving no available dock space. Coastal towns flourished in a short time, their wealth attracting pirates and raiders. Reports frequently arrived of attacks not only on merchant ships but on towns themselves. Fighting this scourge required warships that the kingdom struggled to build fast enough, forcing the king to send armed ships from the Navy's main base to other trade cities on a permanent basis. Alongside the sailors, not only did their families leave, but so did the support staff, carpenters, joiners, and blacksmiths. This continued until only what Grendel now saw remained. In that time, the city had all but emptied, losing its strategic importance and becoming a mere provincial town. At the fortress, Grendel was met by Officer Cliffs, the acting garrison commander, who appeared no older than 40. Despite his relatively young age, his hair was nearly white with streaks of gray. His rugged face bore 2 small scars, likely earned in combat. He greeted the new commander with obvious displeasure, as he had expected the position to go to him after serving as interim commander for over a month, and for nearly half a year before that, while the old commander had been ill. But upon seeing the document signed by the king himself, Cliffs's hopes vanished. His only consolation was the thought that the newly appointed commander might not last long in this dreary town and would quickly flee back to the capital. "So, what did you do to get sent here?" he asked dryly. Grendel, knowing her circumstances would eventually become known, decided to be honest. "The king sent me here because I challenged a captain of the royal guard to a duel. For that kind of insolence, you'd normally be demoted to a common soldier, if not sent to hard labor for life," he said, gathering his belongings from the desk. "Mind sharing how you escaped that fate?" The king's advisor intervened on my behalf. "Have you decided where you'll be staying?" "I thought I'd stay in the fortress. Surely there's some place for me here." "Of course." Cliffs poked his head out of the office and shouted, "Quinn, where are you?" A minute later, a young man about Grendel's age appeared. "He'll show you the available rooms," Cliff said. "Tomorrow, I'll introduce you to the garrison." Once they left the office, the young man extended his hand and introduced himself. "Soldier Quinn." Taking his hand, she replied, "Grendel." Collecting her belongings, Quinn led her down a long corridor. "Don't mind Commander Cliffs. He's always grumpy, but he's a good man. I'll keep that in mind. What position did they send you here for?" "Garrison commander." "What?" he exclaimed. "Are you deaf?" "No, ma'am." "Please don't call me ma'am. Just commander will do. I'm a commoner myself, and I'm not used to such formalities." "Here we are," Quinn said, gesturing to the doors on either side of the corridor. "Take your pick." "I'm not picky. Any room will do," she replied, stepping into the nearest one. It was a small room with a barred window that let in some sunlight. The furnishings included a large bed, a wooden table thick with dust, a wardrobe niche, and a couple of wooden chairs. "This will do," Grendel said, starting to tidy up her new quarters. The news of the new commander's arrival quickly spread through the city. Not only did her future subordinates come to take a look, but so did other prominent citizens of Seafort. Among them was the town governor, who came not only to pay a courtesy visit, but also to learn more about the capital, a place he'd never visited but planned to see soon. Grendel promised to share her stories at their next meeting. Due to the frequent visits from uninvited guests, she ended up cleaning until late at night. As soon as she finished arranging her belongings, she collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. The steady murmur of the ocean lulled her into a deep sleep, and she didn't stir until a knock on the door awoke her the next morning. Opening the door, she saw Cliffs standing there. "The morning muster has started, or do you want me to delay it?" "I'll be quick. Take your time. I'll wait." Grendel quickly donned her best uniform, one of 3 sets issued to everyone from soldiers to officers. Though she understood that today was a ceremonial occasion, the start of her official duties, she had no dress uniform, as it was custom-made or bought privately, and she lacked the means. She hadn't received any officer's pay yet, and at the fortress, she'd worked in the kitchen. The last commander of the Lone Tower paid her meagerly, knowing she had no place to go. Seeing her dressed in a simple uniform, Cliffs shook his head disapprovingly but held his tongue. He led her briskly down the stone corridor, and she occasionally had to jog to keep up. Soon, they arrived at the top tier of the main bastion, which housed the watchtower and lighthouse. The entire garrison, a group of 30 men, was already assembled in 2 rows. Most of them were older soldiers, planning to retire soon or bearing injuries from past battles, but still able to serve as sentries or perform maintenance work. A few younger soldiers, mostly locals who hadn't found another trade, had joined for lack of other options. Cliffs introduced the new commander to the soldiers, most of whom Grendel already recognized by face, if not by name. After assigning duties to the watch post and patrol, Cliffs, in his capacity as acting commander and deputy, began showing Grendel around the garrison's facilities and acquainting her with her responsibilities. Grendel quickly memorized her duties, but getting acquainted with the vast fortress took her 2 full days. On the 3rd day of her command, which happened to be a rest day across the kingdom's armed forces, she organized a city patrol and assigned herself to the daytime watch. Although the need for it was minimal, she longed to gaze at the ocean vistas she hadn't seen in ages, combining pleasure with duty by sparing 1 soldier from a mundane task. After all, none of the town's old-timers could recall an attack from either land or sea. What was there to take from these poor people who mostly survived on fishing? After the morning assembly, Grendel positioned herself on the observation deck. Now, she could fully enjoy the vivid seascapes of the great ocean. Far off, large ships with white sails glided over the emerald green waves, heading either north or south. Closer to shore, fishermen in small boats cast their nets, hauling in shimmering fish that sparkled in the sun. Small merchant vessels from nearby villages docked in the bay to trade, buying fish, vegetables grown in large pots outside houses, and salvaged bricks from abandoned buildings. The time flew by, and before she knew it, her shift was over. As her relief arrived, a 3-masted ship sailed along the coastline, steering into the harbor. "We have visitors," noted the incoming watchman. "You let just anyone in?" "In all my years here, no ship that size has ever come in." "Shouldn't we find out what brings it here?" "Probably to buy or sell something," replied the watchman, pointing to the ship docking at one of the piers. "It's a merchant ship. No catapults or archer decks." "I'll go find out the purpose of their visit," Grendel said, heading to the port. She arrived at the dock just as the ship was anchoring and sailors were disembarking, quickly surrounded by nearly the entire population of Seafort. As she pushed through the crowd, Grendel accidentally bumped into one of the crew members. Smiling, he spoke gently. "Go ahead." The commander found his face and voice strangely familiar, though she couldn't recall where she had seen him before. Her memory jolted only when a little girl with a large lollipop walked by, accidentally brushing against her. Grendel remembered herself at that age, and the day a similar ship had anchored near the village of Fisherman's Bay. Sailors, dressed just as these were, had come ashore. This very sailor had spoken with her father outside their small house that day. She had remembered him because he had given her her first piece of candy. No matter how hard she had tried to forget that terrible day, it remained etched in her mind in vivid detail, especially the moment a full moon appeared in the sky, and something strange began happening with the sailor who had been talking to her father. Her mother, sensing something was wrong, had hurried her back into the house. When her father's screams echoed outside, her mother, knowing Grendel's fear of the dark, pushed her into the cellar. "Stay quiet," she whispered. Terrified, little Grendel huddled in a corner, listening to her mother's cries and the sounds of some beast tearing things apart above. Not a sound escaped her in fear. She stayed in the dark cellar all night, and when the first rays of sunlight seeped in through the floorboards and small window cracks, she crawled out. But she was met with an even more horrifying sight. The house in shambles and her mother lying there, covered in wounds. Trying to wake her, the little girl shook her, crying loudly. Soldiers, who had stopped in the fishing village on their way to Lone Tower, heard her and took the orphan with them, as no other living soul was found in the settlement. Over 20 years had passed since that day. Grendel feared she might be mistaken, but as she continued to observe the sailor, the more convinced she became that he was the very man she had seen back then. She found it unsettling that he had not aged a day over such a long span of time. Her observations were interrupted by Soldier Quinn. "Commander, is everything all right? You look pale." Grendel realized the townsfolk were in grave danger, but she had no idea what to do. The only thing that came to mind was to consult the more experienced soldiers. "We need to gather everyone at the fortress. Where will we find them all right now?" Quinn replied. "They're probably in the taverns, drinking wine. We need to act fast. If it's urgent, we should raise the red alert flag over the main bastion. Will they respond to it? They should. It's daytime, so the flag will be visible from anywhere in town. Anyone you see along the way, bring them to the citadel." "What's going on?" Grendel didn't answer, pushing her way through the crowd and hurrying to the fortress. When she arrived, only one person was there, the lookout. Together they raised the red flag over the bastion, signaling danger. Soon, Quinn arrived with about 5 men, and then others from the garrison trickled in, each soldier looking around in confusion and questioning each other. Grendel stayed silent, waiting until as many as possible had gathered. When about 15 soldiers were present, Cliffs appeared. "What's going on? Why is the red flag up?" Grendel finally decided to share what she knew. "We've got killers among us. Werewolves." "What makes you say that?" "A ship just like this one arrived in Fisherman's Bay one evening. By morning, I was the only one left alive." "I don't recall hearing of any place by that name," Cliffs replied. Another officer, Crafts, explained. "It was a long time ago. Fisherman's Bay did exist, but after the massacre, it's been called Dead Village." "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" asked Cliffs. "It might not even be the same ship." "I remember that sailor's face for life. The one who killed my father and mother. What do you propose we do?" Grendel had no plan yet and remained silent. A soldier came to her aid. "We could arrest them. We don't have enough men for that. the deputy commander replied. There's only about 30 of us, and a ship that size has at least 100 sailors, plus they're younger and stronger. What if we asked the townsfolk for help? How are we supposed to explain that these sailors aren't who they claim to be? Then we could send a messenger to the nearest garrison. It's a 3-hour ride, and the moon will rise in an hour and a half, Grendel interjected. That's when the sailors will start transforming into werewolves. The townsfolk won't hide within the walls willingly, Cliffs noted. I suggest we burn the ship, Grendel proposed, pointing to the catapults. What good will that do? It won't save the townsfolk from being slaughtered. At the very least, they won't be able to kill anyone else or escape from here. Won't be able to escape? The deputy commander asked skeptically, pointing to the warships. There are still 2 of ours in the harbor. They could easily take those. You haven't noticed their hands, have you? Grendel replied. They aren't true sailors. I can't explain it, but I believe that ship plays a crucial role in their lives. I've noticed that too, agreed the catapult commander. We can burn it right now. Yes, let's burn it, agreed most of the garrison. Hold on, the deputy urged the group, explaining why they shouldn't act hastily. What if Grendel is wrong? What if they're just ordinary sailors? If we burn their ship, the commander might be protected by her powerful patron, but our fate would be bleak. At best, we'd be sent to rot in some dungeon. At worst, we'd face the gallows or an axe. Selecting a pair of the better-maintained catapults, Officer Crafts asked, What's your plan, then? Wait until they start killing the townsfolk? We could assemble a team of our strongest men, and then go slaughter sailors in front of the townsfolk who may be ordinary people, the commander interjected, as she opened the armory at the top of the bastion. We should wait until they begin to transform. If we do that, too many townsfolk will be harmed. In any case, the townsfolk will suffer, Cliffs responded. It makes no difference whether it's now or when the moon appears in the sky. And if these monsters are anything like you describe, the squad won't stand a chance of surviving until dawn. As a combat officer, I should lead this squad. The final decision is yours, Commander, the catapult officer said, looking at Grendel. If we keep debating, it might be too late to act. Grendel understood this too. 2 catapult crews will destroy the ship on my signal from the dock. They'll stay in the fortress, guarding it and protecting the townsfolk. The squad led by my deputy will clear the fortress of any intruders. Then move out to clean the city of werewolves on signal. Who will signal from the dock? Cliffs asked. Looking around at the others, none seemed suitable for such a deadly task, so Grendel volunteered. Who else? I will. The commander should stay in the fortress and direct the operation. Everyone knows what they need to do. They'll manage without me. May I go with you? Quinn offered his help. You're more needed here than with me there, Grendel replied, taking 2 short swords from the armory. Armed, she immediately headed for the dock, where the preparations were already in full swing. Supplies for the ship's destruction, baskets of coals and flammable liquid, were being brought to the catapults. Cliffs's squad was busy clearing the fortress of people. By the time Grendel reached the large sailing ship, nearly everyone had dispersed, except for 4 crew members and about 20 local onlookers, who paid no mind to the garrison commander or the sheathed swords slung over her back. She stood patiently near the gangplank and waited. Soon the sun dipped below the horizon, and a pale moon rose in the sky. Its dim light cast shadows over the stone walls of the fortress, then danced on the ripples of the bay. As the light touched the ship, it began to transform. The vessel's wooden hull turned black. and the once white sails became tattered rags. Someone in the crowd screamed upon seeing the sailors drop to the ground, morphing into beasts. Without hesitation, Grendel sprang into action, rushing one of the transforming creatures and swinging her sword to decapitate him. The second was silenced with a swift cut across his throat, convulsing briefly before lying still. She managed to kill a third, but the fourth had fully transformed into a massive wolf-like creature, standing on powerful legs and scraping its claws against the wooden dock. The werewolf readied itself to charge at her, but at that moment a basket filled with coals and incendiary liquid splashed into the water near the ship. Another struck the deck, igniting a blaze. It was clear that the soldiers on the bastion had spotted the commotion at the dock, if not seen, then certainly heard the shouts of people witnessing the sailors' transformation into wolf-like creatures. The werewolf forgot Grendel and leaped to the ship, desperately trying to extinguish the flames. Within seconds, dozens of other creatures appeared on the dock, running on all fours. The townsfolk kept a safe distance, watching in shock as the werewolves scrambled to douse the fire. Though the creatures managed to briefly subdue the flames, the third and fourth gifts from Seafort's garrison thwarted their efforts. The ship turned into a raging inferno, and the creatures on board became living torches. Soon Cliff's team arrived, only to witness Grendel's work. Half an hour later, all that remained of the ship was its smoldering hull, devoid of life. The charred ropes holding it to the dock had burned away, allowing the wreckage to drift into the current and be carried out. The silent onlookers were startled by a loud shout, "Make way for the king's advisor." The crowd parted, creating a path on the dock. A man in a long cloak, hood drawn over his head, appeared, flanked by 4 well-armed guards. He glanced at the ship's remains, which were slowly drifting toward the open ocean, then at the slain werewolves. Turning to Grendel, he asked, "Were there heavy losses?" "I don't know exactly, but I believe not." "Very good," he replied, heading toward his carriage. "Thank you very much," Grendel said, as she had planned to do when meeting him. Pausing, one of the kingdom's most influential men replied, "No, thank you for saving these people. It seems I was not mistaken in you." At night, strange sounds echoed throughout the forest. Here, there, everywhere. 2 of them were on a mission, tasked with capturing a predator that had been terrorizing the outskirts of a small town for days. Rumor had it there wasn't just one animal, but an entire pack. Suddenly, in mere seconds, the device's matrix generated a thermogram of a 4-legged creature. One creature. It was enormous. Not a wolf, but not a bear either. Richie pulled his gaze from the thermal imager the moment an object appeared on the infrared screen. "Psst," he quietly called to his partner. Nancy, lying a bit farther away, had camouflaged herself and was observing through pseudo-binoculars. She, too, noticed the movement and was about to aim. "Step aside," came his steady, commanding voice. She turned around, her face scrunching in displeasure. The beast, apparently having heard something, stopped 15 meters from them, its muscles tense as it looked around and sniffed the air in jerky, anxious breaths. Sensing something unfolding behind her, Nancy looked at him in horror. Fear began to creep through her, freezing her movements. Her pupils dilated, her pulse quickened, adrenaline shot through her veins. The predator caught the scent of sweat and turned its head directly toward them. "Don't move," she read from Richie's lips. He could see the creature's eyes flash yellow. The optical scope glinted treacherously in the moonlight. Damn at the worst possible moment. The predator noticed. It snarled, then let out a long, piercing howl. Was it some kind of signal? It arched its back, then dashed straight toward the hidden snipers. "Shoot to kill!" Richie screamed, standing up and aiming with all his strength. Nancy lifted her rifle, aiming directly at the target. Her unsteady fingers found the trigger. The force of the shot threw her back nearly 2 meters. Sharp pain surged through her spine, taking her breath away and shrouding her vision in darkness. Damn it. Richie cursed through clenched teeth as he glimpsed Nancy losing consciousness out of the corner of his eye. Her bullet had only grazed the creature's shoulder, and it kept running. In a few seconds, it would reach him. "Die, you beast!" he roared, furiously unleashing a round of bullets into the predator. Leaping off a large rocky outcrop and extending its front paws, the creature made a final leap. Just as the bullet struck, it froze in midair for a second, let out a last agonized yelp, and finally crashed to the ground lifeless. Richie rushed over to Nancy. She lay on the withered leaves, her limbs bent awkwardly. Next to her head, he noticed a small rock, likely the one she'd hit with the back of her head. He placed his hand on her neck. There was a pulse, but it was faint. He paused, listening to the sounds of the forest. Was there another one of these creatures nearby? Apart from the chirping of birds in the trees and an indistinct rustling in the bushes, there was nothing suspicious. To be sure, he lifted his thermal imager to his eyes. Clear. They needed to get out of here, and fast. He hastily gathered their few pieces of equipment and picked her up. It was a good thing she was small, barely weighing more than 90 pounds. Though she might have put on some muscle over her years of service. The main thing now was to reach the road without hindrance, where they'd left their van. Across the road, from the shadowy edge of the forest, something was watching them. He couldn't see it as 2 more yellow eyes flashed briefly before retreating into the darkness. It allowed him to leave. The doorbell rang long and incessant. Jenna barely managed to open her eyes. God, she didn't want to get up. She glanced at the clock, 5 to 10. Who could possibly be here this early? She looked over at her sister, who had also woken up and was trying to sit up, swinging her legs over to the right side of the bed. Nancy braced her hands on the bed and immediately grimaced. Her head was pounding unbearably. "Just lie down," said the red-haired girl. "I'll get it." Crossing the kitchen, which opened into the hallway, she noticed it was dark in the house, and judging by the sound, rain was drumming on the street outside. She groped for the switch, and the light flicked on. Through the lace of the white curtain on the door window, Jenna could make out the shadow of a man swaying slightly from side to side. "Richie!" she murmured in shock, quickly letting him in. "Hey, sunshine," he greeted her, kissing her cheek before taking off his leather jacket and draping it over the back of a chair. "How's my fighter doing?" he asked cheerfully, and without waiting for an invitation, headed toward the sisters' room. By then, Nancy was already up from the bed, trying to stand by leaning against the wall. "Easy, easy," he said, rushing to her side, guiding her to sit back down with his hands on her shoulders. "What did the doctor tell you? Bed rest. You're already looking better, by the way." "Does your mouth ever shut?" she muttered, wincing. "You're all charm," he said with a grin. "Shut up already," Jenna said, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "Hey, sweetheart, why don't you go make us some coffee?" he asked her softly, glancing over her shoulder at her bright, beaming face. "Consider it done, sir," she replied, giving a playful salute with her hand to her head. He waited until she was out of sight, then leaned in close to Nancy's face. "We've tracked down 3 more of them in the area," he whispered quickly, glancing back to check. Jenna was in the kitchen, brewing coffee and humming something cheerful under her breath. "What?" Nancy shook her head in disbelief, her eyes widening. "Believe it. There's no way there could be simultaneous attacks in 3 different locations at once. Looks like doomsday is coming for us." He nodded gravely. "They're avenging their fallen comrade and beginning to move in." His gaze turned wild. "And this happened in broad daylight?" "No, yesterday, during our last raid." "Do you really think they only roam around at night?" he asked quietly. "Although maybe not. Remember the monster from last night? Looked pretty horrific, didn't it? So what's your next move? Going solo, or will you choose a new partner?" Richie turned around again to make sure Jenna wasn't watching. She was already pouring coffee into mugs. "I'll let you know by phone," he nodded, pulling back from her. That day, Richie's voice had been broadcast on the radio, and he even appeared on a local news channel. He announced that their small town was in a state of emergency and that everyone should take maximum precautions. "Please do not go outside after 6 p.m. tonight. Keep all doors and windows shut. Try not to turn on any lights, and if possible, move quietly. Better yet, if you have a basement, lock yourselves in there. In the past 3 days, more than 30 people have been killed, and 86 livestock animals have been slaughtered. Need I say more?" He paused purposefully. "Keep any pets you have indoors as well. Gather only the essentials. That's all from me. Stay safe. The purge will begin at nightfall." Standing in the living room, Jenna nervously bit her lip. She needed to get out immediately. She ran through hundreds of possible excuses in her mind, searching for one that would make her older sister let her go. Nancy was still awake, sitting on the couch, engrossed in watching a segment on current issues. A shame. Even a heavy dose of sleeping pills added to her orange juice hadn't worked in the last half hour. Running out of ideas, she finally just called her sister's name. "Nancy?" "Huh?" she responded reluctantly, her eyes likely reading the ticker scrolling across the screen. Her brows were furrowed. "I'll just pop over to Wendy's for a minute." "What for?" she asked without turning around. "Well, I just remembered I left my phone there, in case Richie calls." "I'm worried about him," Jenna replied, trembling with impatience. Wendy was her classmate and neighbor. In truth, the phone was in her back skirt pocket. She glanced at the clock. It was already past 6. Time was slipping by. She could feel it. He was waiting, watching from somewhere nearby. She felt his patience waning. "Call him from mine," Nancy replied calmly. Jenna's eyes widened. "No, that won't work." Her sister turned around, looking at her in surprise. "What's gotten into you?" Jenna's anger flared, and she shook her head, taking 2 steps back. "Don't do it," came Nancy's warning voice. Seeing her sister start to get up, Jenna darted toward the door. "Jenna, get back here!" Nancy shouted after her, but Jenna had already slammed the door behind her. Nancy could have sworn she heard something wedging it shut from the outside. "Damn it!" she hissed furiously. "What's wrong with her?" Her fingers fumbled to dial Richie's number. The phone rang, the sound agonizingly long. After the 5th ring, his voice finally came on. "You have terrible timing." "Jenna ran off," Nancy shouted, fear lacing her voice. "What? Why did you let her go?" He yelled back. "My girl," he whispered softly. "It just happened. Just now," she babbled. "Something's wrong with her." "What do you mean?" "She's aggressive." Her voice shook with quiet sobs. "An extermination squad is on its way," was the last thing he said before the line cut to a cold silence. The night had been tense. When the special unit surrounded the first slain predator, Richie recognized it as a true werewolf. And as it turned out, there were many more. They managed to gun down at least 5. His worst fears were confirmed when he found his girlfriend missing from her neighbor's house. Jenna had lied, but why? He glanced at his watch. Nearly 4 in the morning, and there was still no word on her. He stood outside her house, rifle in hand, ready to pull the trigger at a moment's notice. Nancy had a radio with her and was watching him through her kitchen window in complete darkness, her weapon at the ready. The thought of something happening to Jenna tore at him from the inside. Unbidden tears blurred his vision. He was terrified of losing her because he loved her so much. She was one of those good girls, still a virgin at 20. Once she'd told him he would never forget their wedding night, and that they'd marry as soon as she finished school. This was her final year. Suddenly, from his right, he caught the crunch of breaking branches. The darkness was beginning to lift, making night vision gear unnecessary. He raised his rifle, sighting carefully. Out of the bushes, a 3-meter creature lumbered toward him, moving almost too slowly. Its shoulder height alone was over 1.5 meters. What a brute, he thought. Must be an alpha. Richie remained still, motionless. "Come on, just a bit closer," he murmured. The creature was now only 3 steps away. It moved cautiously, never taking its eyes off its prey. "Richie, behind you!" came Nancy's frantic voice over the radio. In that instant, he spun around just as a shot rang out. The beast in front of him roared, tensed, and leapt. Richie screamed in a frenzy. The gunfire fell silent as the werewolf crashed to the ground. Nancy ran outside toward Richie. Wrapping her arms around his shoulders, she burst into tears. "She's gone. She's still gone. Wait." She froze suddenly. He followed her gaze as it shifted from cautious to bewildered, then horrified. He turned. "No," he cried, falling to his knees. "No, Jenna, no!" He collapsed, tears streaming down his face as he reached out to touch her blood-matted red hair. Where the werewolf should have been, the naked form of his beloved lay sprawled, her skin painted in the first light of dawn. She was alive, but there was still a wild, bestial rage flickering in her eyes. Jenna's chest heaved with labored breaths, and bit by bit, human awareness returned to her face. Her body was still racked with spasms. The remnants of the beast were not about to release her easily. She was a werewolf. That was undeniable now. "Jenna, hold on." Richie clutched her tightly, desperately trying to protect her, though he knew her true enemy lay within. "She can't stay here anymore," Nancy said firmly, standing beside him. "She's one of them now, and this will never go away." "No," Richie lifted his head sharply. "She's still human. We can help her. She just needs to heal. She's herself now. We won't let her become a monster." Nancy narrowed her eyes, trying to comprehend his conviction. Yes, Jenna was now a werewolf, and that wouldn't change. But they could help her keep her humanity, to control the beast within. "She needs treatment, but not in a hospital," Nancy finally said. "We can take her to our safe house, but—" She paused, exhaling heavily. "You know as well as I do that she's one of them now. She can't be left unsupervised." "I know." Richie's voice trembled, though it was filled with determination. "But she won't become a monster. We'll handle this. She just needs to recover from her injuries, and she'll be herself again." Jenna opened her eyes, looking at him, her gaze filled with pain, yet still human. She pressed herself against his chest, seeking warmth. "Richie," her voice was barely a whisper, "I don't want to become one of them." "You won't. I promise," he whispered, holding her tightly. "We'll find a way to handle this. You're still here. You're not lost." Nancy scanned the area, wary. Danger lingered. They didn't know if more werewolves were nearby. They needed to move. "We have to go," she said decisively. "While it's quiet, we'll get her to a safe place. You need to be ready. This is only the beginning." With effort, Richie lifted Jenna into his arms, feeling the lingering beastly strength within her frail frame. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't let the beast take over. They weren't just fighting to heal Jenna's wounds. They were fighting to help her master her new nature. Richie carefully hoisted Jenna, her body trembling. Though weak from injury, she was still stronger than an ordinary person. Wild energy pulsed within her, refusing to leave even in moments of frailty. Nancy stood by, her face tense. They understood that everything had changed, and a long battle lay ahead. "We need to get out of here while we still can," Nancy whispered, glancing around. The forest was far too quiet, and that silence was more unsettling than anything else. "We don't know how many more of them are out there." Richie nodded. They made their way to the van parked a few kilometers down the road. Nancy walked ahead, weapon at the ready, while Richie followed, carefully carrying Jenna. He could feel her breath against his chest, her grip on his shirt tightening as if she were afraid to let go. Her eyes drifted shut, but she clung to consciousness. The road seemed endlessly long, but they finally reached the van. Nancy opened the back doors and helped Richie lay Jenna on the seat. He sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, while Nancy got into the driver's seat. "Let's get to the safe house," she said shortly, starting the engine. "She'll be safe there. No one needs to know what happened." The van sped off. Richie watched Jenna, her face pale, her breathing ragged. He could sense her fear, though she tried to hide it. It wasn't fear for her life. It was fear of what she had become. Her body no longer felt like her own, and Richie knew that regaining control would be no easy task. Several hours later, they reached the safe house, a small, isolated cabin in the mountains where the team often retreated during missions. The place was secure and completely cut off from the outside world. Here, they could focus on helping Jenna. Richie and Nancy carried her inside and laid her on the bed. Without wasting a moment, Nancy began tending to her wounds. Jenna moaned in pain but didn't transform. The beast within her seemed subdued, likely exhausted from its first emergence. "It's temporary," Nancy said, wrapping her wounds. "Her injuries are healing faster than usual, but it doesn't change the fact that she's a werewolf now. When she recovers, the transformation might happen again, especially under the influence of the moon. But we have to find a way to control it," Richie replied firmly, not taking his eyes off Jenna's face. "She's still here? We won't let her become a monster." Nancy nodded, though her eyes held worry. Controlling the inner beast was possible, but it wouldn't be easy. They would have to find a balance, teaching Jenna to manage the transformation and remain aware, even in her beast form. It could take a long time. Days passed. Jenna was slowly recovering, but a wild gleam began appearing in her eyes, especially at night. Richie and Nancy watched her closely, stopping her each time the beast threatened to take over, helping her regain control. "It's like holding a monster inside," Jenna said quietly one night, sitting on the cabin porch. Her body still trembled, as if fighting something within. "I can feel it trying to break free. It wants to take me over completely." Richie sat beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "We'll teach you how to control it," he said gently. "You're stronger than you think. You already took back your human form after the first transformation, which means you can control it." Jenna nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "I'm scared, Richie," she admitted. I'm afraid that one day I'll lose control, that I'll hurt you, or someone else. You're not alone, he replied quietly, squeezing her hand. We're with you. We'll get through this together. They knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. Jenna needed to learn to control the beast inside her. It required not only willpower but also understanding the nature of the creature within. Nancy suggested starting with training. Every day, Jenna would have to consciously control her state, preventing the beast from taking over. Their first training exercise was meditation. Nancy explained that Jenna had to learn to sense the beast, not suppress it, but channel its power. During these moments, Richie stayed by her side, observing her every move. You need to feel its energy, Nancy instructed, standing nearby. Don't try to get rid of it. It's part of you. But you can direct that strength where you need it. Jenna sat on the floor with her eyes closed, trying to concentrate. She felt the beast inside her, a pulsing power ready to burst forth at any moment. But now she wasn't fighting it. She was learning to direct it. At first, it was incredibly difficult. Her body trembled, muscles tensed as if on the verge of transformation. But Richie's calm presence helped her stay focused. I can feel it, she whispered, opening her eyes. But now, I know how to hold it back. Great, Nancy nodded with a faint smile. This is just the beginning, Jenna. Now you'll be able to control it longer. The key is not letting fear take over. And so, they began daily training sessions. With each passing day, Jenna grew more in tune with her new nature, learning to harmonize it with her human side. The beast still lived within her, but now she knew how to keep it under control. However, they understood that sooner or later, her abilities would have to be tested in real situations. Training in the safety of the cabin was one thing, but out on the streets of their town, other werewolves were still lurking. One day, they would face them again. Weeks passed since Jenna had begun her training to control the beast within her. Every night was a trial for her, and every day was filled with a constant struggle to hold on to her humanity. Richie and Nancy stood by her side, supporting her every step of the way. Yet, despite the progress, they knew that the real challenges were still ahead. With each passing day, Jenna grew stronger. Her ability to control the beast within intensified, and even when transformation seemed near, she learned not to give in to fear. But Richie couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in her personality. Jenna was no longer the fragile girl who posed no threat. The werewolf had become part of her essence, affecting her behavior in ways he hadn't expected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat on the cabin's porch. The stillness of the forest was broken only by the faint rustling of leaves and the crackling of the fire. Nancy, lost in her thoughts, gazed silently at the flames. Jenna sat beside Richie, gripping his hand as if afraid to let go. We can't stay here forever, she murmured, her voice restrained but firm. Richie flinched at her words. He'd known for a while that this conversation would come up eventually. A few weeks ago, he'd begun thinking about the future. But each time, he avoided bringing it up, clinging to a faint hope that some miracle would intervene. Do you want to go back to the city? He asked carefully. No, Jenna replied, shaking her head. I can't go back. I don't feel human anymore. The beast inside me is too strong for me to live a normal life. I'd be a danger in the city. Richie felt the weight of her words. As much as he hated to admit it, he knew she was right. Werewolves couldn't live among humans. Every day was a risk to herself and everyone around her. He closed his eyes, searching for a solution, but there was none. There's another way, he finally said, his voice low but resolute. We can leave. Leave for the forest. Far away from people. A place where you don't have to hide or fight every day. We could start a life away from it all." Nancy flinched and turned to him sharply. Her face twisted in anger, her eyes narrowing. "Are you insane?" she shouted, her voice brimming with indignation. "You're ready to give up everything to live in the middle of nowhere so she can change in peace? That's not a life, Richie. You're sacrificing everything for her animal nature. What about you?" Richie hesitated, but deep down, he'd already known his answer for a long time. He wasn't willing to lose Jenna. She was still a part of his life, and if it required sacrifices, he was ready to make them. "I'll go with her," he said softly, his eyes fixed on Jenna. "I'll be with her no matter what." Nancy's eyes flashed with anger as she took a step closer, her gaze burning. "And what about you, Richie?" she demanded, breathing heavily as though barely containing her fury. "Do you understand that you'll become one of them if you stay by her side? Are you ready to give up everything you've known for this?" Richie nodded slowly. "Yes," he said quietly but firmly. "I'll become like her." Nancy froze, paralyzed by his words. Her angry gaze slowly turned to one of horror and disbelief. You're serious," she whispered, barely audible, her eyes never leaving his. "You're willing to abandon your humanity? To become like those we've hunted? You know it's irreversible, Richie. You'll lose yourself." Richie didn't look away. He knew her words were true. He knew that once transformed, there'd be no turning back. He'd no longer be human in the way he was before. But it didn't matter. Jenna still meant everything to him, beast or not. He couldn't leave her, even if it meant becoming the same. "I understand all that," Richie said calmly, "but I can't leave her. She's still here, and I won't let the beast take her over. If this is the only way to be with her, then I'll take it." Nancy exhaled sharply and looked away. She couldn't bear to look at him. To her, it felt like a betrayal of everything they'd fought for, everything they'd stood for all these years. He was willing to become one of those they'd always fought against, all for one girl, even if she was his love. "I can't be part of this," she said firmly, her voice trembling with anger. "I can't accept your choice. You're no longer the person I worked with. You chose the beast over the man." She spun around abruptly and walked away from the cabin, her steps quick and resolute. Richie didn't try to stop her. He knew she wouldn't change her mind. A storm of emotions brewed within him, but he couldn't shake his resolve. Jenna, who had watched the entire exchange in silence, remained still. She understood how difficult it was for Nancy to accept it all, and yet she couldn't blame her. Inside, she wrestled with her own inner conflict. She knew that she would always be different now. Her life would never return to what it had been. She belonged to another world now, a world of beasts. But with Richie beside her, the fear lessened. When Nancy disappeared into the trees, Jenna spoke softly. "You don't have to do this for me, Richie. I don't want you to lose yourself for my sake." Richie turned to her, gently brushing his hand along her cheek. "I would have already lost myself if I lost you," he said, his voice filled with tenderness. "I can't live without you, Jenna. You're still here, and that's what matters most." She couldn't hold back and wrapped her arms around him tightly, pressing herself against his chest. Her body trembled, as if the beast within her still raged, but she knew that with Richie by her side, she could keep it in check. A few days later, they left the cabin. Richie and Jenna ventured deep into the forest, far from anyone who might find them, friends or enemies. There, in the wilderness, among wild trees and creatures, they started a new life, one free from the confines of civilization and the prying eyes of others. Day by day, Jenna learned to control the beast within her more and more. She no longer feared losing herself in transformation. Next to Richie, she felt strong. Both of them understood that a life away from people was the only way to keep her beast under control. One night, as the full moon cast its light over their camp in the forest, Richie felt that the moment had come to make his choice. He knew that as long as he remained human, he could never fully understand Jenna, could never stand beside her as an equal. He could sense her pain, her struggle, and he was willing to go through the same thing for her. Jenna looked at him with worry, sensing what was happening. "Are you sure?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "There's no going back, Richie. You'll become like me." Richie nodded, his gaze steady and determined. "I'm sure," he said. "We'll be together. I'm ready for this." Jenna squeezed his hand, feeling the wild energy of the beast stirring within her. She didn't want him to suffer as she had, but she knew there was no other way for them to truly be together. That night, Richie accepted his fate. Under the moonlight, he allowed the beast that lived within Jenna to bite him. The pain was unbearable, but he didn't back down. He knew this was the only way to stay with her. When it was over, they sat side by side, their bodies still trembling from the ordeal. Richie could feel the changes beginning within him, his body adapting to its new reality. But with Jenna next to him, he felt no fear. He knew that now they would be together forever, even if it meant becoming part of the world of beasts. They were now among those they had once considered enemies. But to them, it no longer mattered. Far from humanity, deep in the forest, they had started a new life. A life where the beast and human could coexist. Nancy was no longer with them. She hadn't been able to accept their decision and had left, leaving them to face this new world alone.